On the remote edge of Northern California, surrounded by dense forests and cold Pacific winds, stands Pelican Bay State Prison, a facility built with one purpose: to control the inmates no other prison could handle. When it opened in 1989, California was drowning in violence. Prison gangs ran operations from inside the walls, riots erupted across the state, and some inmates were so dangerous that regular maximum security units could no longer contain them. Lawmakers needed a fortress, something beyond maximum security, something absolute. So they built Pelican Bay, a prison carved out of isolation, a place where sunlight barely entered, a compound designed so that inmates almost never touched another human being. It was the start of a new era in American incarceration, and it would change the country forever. But Pelican Bay's true legacy wouldn't be written on blueprints. It would be written in the stories of the men locked inside. Pelican Bay wasn't built like other prisons. Every inch of the facility was engineered to separate, contain, and control. The heart of the complex was the SHU, the Security Housing Unit, a Supermax within a Supermax. It was a maze of concrete pods, steel doors, and windowless cells arranged so meticulously that inmates could be moved without ever being seen by another person. Cells were small, cold, and silent. A solid steel door sealed each one. Meals were delivered through a narrow slot. The only fresh air came from a small fenced exercise pen, barely the size of a walk-in closet. Lights stayed on almost constantly. There were no phones in the cells, no contact visits, no open yard, no sound except guards' footsteps echoing through the corridor. The architecture itself was a punishment, slow, psychological, relentless. And yet, this was only the beginning of the system that made Pelican Bay infamous. Because once men were placed inside the SHU, few knew when, or if, they would ever leave. Pelican Bay wasn't simply a building. It was the front line of a quiet war. Inside California's prisons, a handful of powerful gangs dominated everything, controlling money, drugs, violence, and influence across the state. These gangs operated like armies, with strict rules, coded communication, and leadership structures that extended far beyond prison walls. Pelican Bay became the place where the state tried to break that control. Inmates suspected of being gang leaders or key-foot soldiers were sent here, often indefinitely. The idea was simple: cut off communication, break the chain of command, and eventually weaken the entire organization. But it didn't work as planned. Even inside the SHU, inmates found ways to communicate: coded letters, taps on pipes, messages hidden in legal forms. Some ran gang operations from cells they hadn't left in years. And the state's response only escalated tensions. The SHU filled quickly. Gang investigations intensified. And the question grew louder: how long can a human being survive in total isolation before something breaks? The answer would soon come, not from the guards, but from the inmates themselves. Most Americans never saw inside Pelican Bay's SHU, but for the men who lived there, it was a world without sound, touch, or time. Days disappeared. Months blurred together. Years passed without ever seeing another inmate face to face. An inmate could spend 23 hours a day inside a concrete box the size of a bathroom. The remaining hour, if granted, meant stepping into a solitary pen with no sky visible, only metal grating overhead. For many, the silence became a weight heavier than chains. Men talked to themselves just to hear another voice. Some paced in circles for hours to keep from losing their sense of movement. Others stared at the same wall until cracks began to look like shapes or faces. Psychologists warned that isolation on this level could permanently damage the brain. Hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, emotional breakdowns. Some inmates entered the SHU sane and left broken. Some never left at all. But the system continued, because officials believed it was necessary. Until one day, the prisoners decided they had endured enough, and the world outside finally heard their voices. In 2011, everything changed. Hundreds of Pelican Bay inmates, many who hadn't touched another human being in years, coordinated one of the most powerful protests in modern prison history, a hunger strike. At first, guards believed it would last a day or two, but it didn't. It grew. More SHU units joined, then general population, then inmates in other prisons across California. Within weeks, more than 6,000 prisoners throughout the state refused food, risking permanent damage or death. Their message was simple: end indefinite isolation, end the broken system, end the silence. The strike forced the public to see what was happening inside Pelican Bay, The endless isolation, the lack of sunlight, the conditions many experts called psychological torture. News crews arrived. Lawyers filed lawsuits. Human rights groups demanded reform. For the first time in decades, Pelican Bay wasn't hidden anymore. It was national news. And the hunger strikes were only the beginning of a fight that would reshape the prison forever. The hunger strikes forced California to respond publicly, but the real battle was unfolding in courtrooms. A group of attorneys, many of whom had never set foot inside Pelican Bay before, filed a lawsuit challenging the very foundation of the SHU. They argued that indefinite isolation, sometimes lasting 10, 15, even 20 years, was not just punishment. It was psychological destruction. The lawsuit revealed internal documents the public had never seen, policies that allowed inmates to be held in the SHU for suspected gang affiliation, not violent actions, cases where men were kept in isolation based on artwork, coded drawings, or someone else's testimony. Reports where mental health staff warned repeatedly that long-term isolation was causing irreversible harm. As these details became public, pressure mounted. Advocates, journalists, and even former guards began demanding reform. And for the first time since the SHU was built, the question wasn't whether inmates could survive there. It was whether the system itself could survive the truth. The state had a choice: defend Pelican Bay's past or admit it needed to change. That decision would shape the future of the prison. As the lawsuit gained traction, life inside Pelican Bay shifted. The inmates sensed change in the air, not freedom, but uncertainty. For years, they had lived under a structure where isolation was the ultimate weapon, a system where one wrong association could mean years without human contact. Now, that power was being questioned. Inside the SHU, guards noticed something unusual. Men who had once stopped talking began speaking again. The quiet defiance of the hunger strikes had evolved into something deeper, a belief that change was possible. But hope can be dangerous inside a place built on control. To maintain order, the prison tightened supervision. Cell searches increased. Movement became even more restricted. Rumors spread that the state was preparing for major adjustments. Some inmates feared the reforms would never come. Others feared they would arrive too late. For them, the damage had already been done. Yet the pressure didn't come only from inmates. Politicians began asking questions. Medical experts testified about the psychological impact of isolation. And public opinion shifted sharply. Pelican Bay, once hidden in the remote forests, was now under a national spotlight. And the state could no longer look away. In 2015, after years of legal battles, testimony, and public scrutiny, California reached a groundbreaking settlement. Pelican Bay SSHU, the Supermax that defined American isolation, would never operate the same way again. Indefinite solitary confinement was effectively ended. Thousands of inmates across the state were reviewed for release from isolation. Gang validation procedures, the system that kept many men in the SHU for decades, were dismantled and replaced. For the first time in its history, Pelican Bay began transferring inmates out of the SHU into units where they could have human interaction, sunlight, and programs. It wasn't freedom, but it was transformation. Inside the prison, the news spread slowly. Some inmates didn't believe it at first. After years of empty promises, change felt impossible. But day by day, men who had lived in darkness walked into open yards for the first time in decades. They saw the sun. They felt wind that wasn't filtered through steel grates. Some cried. Some laughed. Some stood silently, overwhelmed. Pelican Bay had not closed, but the Pelican Bay the world feared had begun to disappear. With the SHU reduced, Pelican Bay entered a new era, one filled with questions no one knew how to answer. What happens to a prison built for extreme isolation when isolation is no longer allowed? How do you restructure a facility designed like a fortress without tearing it down? And what becomes of inmates who spent 10, 15, even 20 years in a room barely bigger than a closet? Outside the prison, critics wondered if Pelican Bay still had a purpose. Without its Supermax identity, was it just another high-security prison? Or was the transformation only beginning? Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Not violent, just uncertain. After decades of operating one way, Pelican Bay was being rewritten in real time, and no one knew what the final version would look like. Even after reforms, the shadow of Pelican Bay's past remained. The old SHU units still stand, empty, silent, and cold. Touring them is like walking into a memory carved in concrete. The steel doors, the narrow cells, the echoing hallways where thousands of men spent years without seeing another human face. These units became symbols, reminders of a system the country had once accepted and later condemned. Former inmates described the SHU as a place where time didn't move, where days felt like weeks, where the mind became both enemy and survival tool. And even as California works to redefine Pelican Bay's future, the legacy of its past shapes everything that happens inside those walls. Many inmates coming out of the SHU struggled to adapt to the simplest interactions. Some couldn't tolerate noise. Some avoided eye contact. Some panicked in open spaces because the world felt too big after years of concrete walls. Mental health staff described it as a kind of institutional shock. Inmates who once lived in silence now heard hundreds of voices on the yard. Men who spent years eating alone now sat in crowded dining halls. And for many, it was overwhelming. Rehabilitation programs began expanding inside the prison, small steps toward rebuilding human behavior. Classes on communication. Others drifted between old habits and new possibilities. Reintegration wasn't a switch. It was a struggle, a slow climb out of the psychological depth Pelican Bay had carved over decades. While inmates tried to redefine their lives, the correctional officers faced a transformation of their own. For decades, their training, routines, and safety protocols were built around controlling isolation units. Now, they were navigating a prison with fewer barriers, more movement, and more human interaction. Officers who once patrolled silent hallways were now supervising group programs. Others who relied on isolation as a behavior management tool had to adapt to communication, counseling, and de-escalation strategies. Some welcomed the changes, believing the prison was safer when inmates had purpose. Others felt uncertainty, worried that reduced isolation could lead to instability or violence. Pelican Bay didn't just restructure buildings. It restructured its entire culture. And officers, like inmates, were forced to adjust to a prison that no longer resembled the one they knew. While Pelican Bay transformed internally, the world outside watched closely. Crescent City, the small community surrounding the prison, had relied on Pelican Bay for decades, for jobs, security, and economic stability. Any major change inside the facility sent shockwaves through the local economy. Businesses depended on prison staff. Housing markets fluctuated with employment at the facility. Schools felt the impact of families moving in and out due to transfers. When talk of reducing Pelican Bay's operations surfaced, some residents worried about losing the town's primary source of income. Others questioned whether the prison had brought more harm than good. Pelican Bay wasn't just a correctional institution. It was a pillar that held up an entire region, for better or worse. Its transformation didn't just reshape the prison system, but the community that lived in its shadow. As the years passed, Pelican Bay's transformation sparked a national debate. Reformers argued that the old SHU system violated human rights and created more violence than it prevented. They pushed for education programs, rehabilitation centers, mental health services, and alternatives to long-term isolation. Critics, however, believed the reforms went too far, that some inmates were too dangerous to re-enter general population. They argued that Pelican Bay needed its Supermax identity to control gang activity statewide. The prison became a symbol in a broader national conversation. What should a maximum security prison look like? Should punishment focus on isolation? Or should rehabilitation exist even for the most dangerous offenders? Pelican Bay stood at the center of that argument, not because of what it was, but because of what it was becoming. And the nation watched to see whether California's experiment would succeed or collapse under its own ambition. Today, Pelican Bay remains operational, but it is no longer the fortress of silence it once was. The old SHU units sit mostly empty, reminders of an era that shaped American prison policy for decades. General population yards now host programs that were once unthinkable here. Therapy sessions, education classes, re-entry training. And yet, the prison still carries the weight of its past. Staff walk hallways knowing the old systems could return if violence rises. Inmates carry scars from years spent in isolation. The community relies on the prison for its livelihood. And reformers push for deeper change while critics push back. Pelican Bay is caught in a constant tug-of-war between what it was and what it's trying to become. Its future isn't fixed. Its purpose isn't clear. And its story is far from finished. The prison once known for breaking men now faces a new test. Can it rebuild itself without losing control? Can it evolve without repeating the past? And can a place built on isolation learn to embrace humanity? These questions hang over Pelican Bay like the fog over the Northern California coast, waiting for the next chapter to reveal the answer. Up close, Pelican Bay looks different than it does from a distance. From far away, it's just concrete, razor wire, and fog drifting across the rooftops. But inside, up close, you see the details that defined its legacy. The worn grooves on the floors where officers walked the same path every day. The scratched initials etched into cell doors by inmates who refused to disappear quietly. The faded warning signs, still hanging after decades, reminding everyone who entered that this was a place built for the most dangerous men in America. Walking through the corridors, you hear things most people never notice. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights that never turn off. The metallic echo of a door opening 3 hallways away. The low, constant rumble of ventilation fans pushing recycled air through the building. Inside the old SHU units, the silence hits differently. When you stand in front of one of the cells, you feel how small it really is, how close the walls are, how low the ceiling feels, how little light reaches the concrete. For years, this tiny box was an entire world to the men inside it. You see the marks they left behind, pencil lines on the wall to keep track of days, tiny scratches forming shapes only they understood. A piece of fabric tied to a vent, a symbol of someone trying to hold onto identity. These details aren't dramatic. They aren't loud. But up close, they tell the truth about Pelican Bay far more honestly than any official report ever could. In the general population units, the contrast is striking. Men walking to programs, talking quietly on the yard, participating in classes where once there were none. It's a different rhythm, slower, more human, but still weighed down by the tension of a prison searching for its new identity. Officers watch everything with trained eyes, but even they admit things have changed. Some say the prison feels calmer. Others say it feels uncertain, like a place between 2 eras, carrying the skeleton of the old Pelican Bay while trying to build the new one piece by piece. And when you step outside into the Northern California fog, the prison looks exactly as it always has, cold, massive, silent. But up close, you feel the stories trapped inside its walls. The years of isolation, the hunger strikes, the reforms, the scars, emotional and physical, that men still carry. Pelican Bay is not the place it used to be, but neither is it the place it hopes to become. This close-up reveals one truth: the transformation is not finished. The struggle is not over. And the real story of Pelican Bay is still unfolding, just beneath the surface.